in other modern European countries like Spain and Italy and France and Germany. Somehow we don't have that legislation in place here. We think it's sensible to have that minimum safety level
I
in place.
understand the point about health particularly, but in education, in rail, in nuclear, who ultimately is going to set whatever the minimum level is? It's going to be the government, isn't it?
So we'll have this new law on the statute book. So that's the primary legislation. Then we'll have a secondary piece of legislation which will work through after consulting with the sector and with the public about what the correct level is for that particular sector. So let's go back to rail, your first example. You might say, well, look, there's critical freight that needs to get around the country, which is vital to keeping the economy going at presumably a much less than regular level, or there are critical workers who need to get around the country. And one of the things that's been very distressing on this very now protracted forever rail strike is that the people it's really hurting are not people who can work from home. They're people who actually have to go to their place of work, the hospital porter, the cleaner. People often who are the least well paid or paid in society are suffering the most from this very extended strike. So you might look to provide the bare minimum service, which would help people still get around and do those
would
jobs.
That minimum requirement not also fall onto the government in some of these cases to actually sit down and talk about pay with the unions who are asking them to, particularly the nurses?
Yeah, and actually another part of what we've said today is exactly that, which is, look, it's a new year. It's a good time to make a new start on these things. What we're offering to do is come forward with all of the data that we're presenting to the independent pay review bodies. And it's worth your listeners knowing. We don't just, as a government, in most cases, pluck a number out of thin air. In many of these cases, though not all, there's a public pay review body who take evidence from the unions, from the workers, from the sector, and from government, and then they come to an independent recommendation. And actually, in about 85% of the time, that is accepted in full. I think 98% of the time, it's mostly accepted. So I think the pay review bodies, which have been running for a couple of decades, have been very successful.
But that one of the key issues for nurses is that the government won't even sit down and talk about pay at all. And my point is there not, there should be, shouldn't there, something that requires the government to move further, whoever that government is in the future, to actually deal with the issues that the unions are bringing forward? Is there a commitment in this then to perhaps give more pay to those public sector workers in rail or the NHS to help ward off any strike action?
No, so what we're saying actually is the right way to do this, and the unions asked for the independent pay review bodies in the first place 20 years ago, is through the independent pay review bodies. What we will do is sit down. We'll sit down with anyone. We'll sit down with the unions. We'll sit down with any of the parties involved in this. But what we will do is provide our background data to it. So as we go into the 2023-24, this coming year's pay settlements as well, we'll be completely transparent. We're asking the unions to do the same. What is it that is causing, for example, in one case, one set of workers, why are they asking for a 19% increase? What is the justification? How does that compare with the rest of the economy, etc.? We can get all that data out there, and I think actually help to, I hope, bring these strikes to a resolution, because they're damaging not just for the economy, not just for people who might need the emergency services, and that's why we're saying minimum safety levels, but also for the workers themselves. So I don't know what benefits from this, and we want to see it brought to a close.
This idea, legally set minimum levels, service levels or safety levels, is all stick. There's no carrot here on offer from the government to workers in this sector. And at a time when the government can't guarantee good ambulance services regardless of a strike day.
So actually, I think the healthcare strikes were quite interesting because the Royal College of Nursing took, I thought, the sensible approach of saying, look, we will agree at a nationwide level what minimum safety levels mean. And they provided that during the strike. With the ambulance side of things, different ambulance trusts did different things. There was no nationally agreed level of service or safety. And I think that's just fundamentally dangerous. If you had a heart attack, you need to know that there is an ambulance that's going to be available one way or the other. So all we're trying to do is kind of create a sort of overall platform. It's what countries like France and Germany do.
There are ambulances now, though. I mean, the ambulance service is absolutely on its knees.
Well, certainly the case that the combination of COVID and all the backlogs and the issues of social care, the long-term care stuff, has meant that there's a huge backlog. Again, actually, the Prime Minister yesterday stood up and said this is one of his 5 top priorities, and it's not just words, which I think listen to this and go, well, it's just politicians just saying that. Actually, your listeners may not be aware, but we've actually hired 32,000 more nurses since 2019. So we are increasing both the number of nurses and the amount of cash going to the NHS massively. But of course, like all global health services, we're also recovering from the COVID crisis as well.
A couple of quick things before we finish. One of your colleagues, Alex Chalk, said to us yesterday that pay rises in the public sector would be an unkindness, his word, as it would increase inflation. Do you agree that a pay rise for nurses or anyone else in the public sector is an unkindness?
No, and we're offering pay rises. So not to lose the fact that actually nurses alone, actually when all the rest of the public service was being frozen, the NHS alone, I should say, NHS workers, 1.2 million people actually received £1,400 more on average last year, even whilst the rest of the public service was being frozen. And this year there's a pay offer on the table that the Independent Pay Review Board has proposed for nurses in the NHS.
So it's not inflationary, is it? Offering a pay rise.
What I was going to say is, of course, there's a point at which it becomes inflationary. If you chase inflation...
What point is that?
Yeah, well, at the moment, it depends where inflation is. But if you chase inflation, currently over 10%, then you end up in a cycle where you never get out. That's what happened in the 70s. You never get out of an inflationary spiral. We need to get out of that. The other thing, one of the other 5 pledges the PM made yesterday was he wants to see inflation halved this year. And it looks possible to do. The projections are that will happen, according to the independent projections.
Yes, without the government doing anything.
Well, I was going to say, the danger is if you chase inflation through higher pay awards in the public sector, then you'll end up in a position where everyone is hurt in the end. And we don't want to be in that position.
I just think it might not be lost on people that when inflation goes up, it's not the government's responsibility, it's exogenous events. But when it comes down, the government claims a win.
No, I think that's cheap, actually. I don't agree with that. I don't come on your programme to try and deny things are the government's responsibility. I think most of your listeners will...
So inflation rising is the government's responsibility?
Well, of course, everything's the government's responsibility. I think, having said that, your listeners will understand that Putin invading Ukraine pushed up energy prices and inflation globally. But I don't seek to demur from that. I don't seek to run away from the responsibility of governments on inflation any more than I would seek to not say that government was something to do with the fact that right now, as you and I speak, we've got the lowest unemployment that we've had for the best part of 50 years. Both sides of those are things which are connected to the government, and that's what a grown-up conversation involves.
2 very quick things, 2 grown-up issues on your brief. Why are you pushing to subsidise a private company, a Chinese company who own British Steel to the tune of £300 million as was reported over the Christmas period?
So we have steel industry in this country. It's pretty important to the future of our country. People will argue whether G20 countries all tend to have their own steel industry, and people will argue over the level of support. I didn't particularly recognise the figures I saw over Christmas report in the papers, but there are. But it's a fact of matter that there are many important jobs. There's an important advanced manufacturing sector at stake here, and so it's always my job to be looking at that very carefully.
If it's that important, Secretary of State, why doesn't the state just own British Steel? Why is it sold to a Chinese company with a £27 billion turnover, who will then receive a taxpayer bailout of £300 million?
Well, look, I don't think the actual ultimate ownership here is the issue, particularly since steel has been very loss-making globally in the last few years. You might be very pleased that the British taxpayers, not all your listeners might be, hasn't been owning that increasing debt. It's not been a profitable field to be in.
So it's not that important?
No, I was saying it's not a very profitable area. You were arguing it should be state-controlled and state-owned. That would mean that these losses were all on the taxpayer. I'm not sure that's the immediate answer. But there is and again, as a business secretary, I understand that it is very important that we consider, where our industrial importance lie, where industrially important sectors lie, and we do have to think about those things. But as I say, the figures I saw mentioned over the Christmas break aren't figures that I immediately recognise. Can
you rule out that you're going to add 12p to the price of a litre of petrol?
That I'm going to I think I should entirely rule it out.
Oh, fantastic. So you're not going to do it. Is the government going to do it?
Not that I'm aware of. No, where's that story? I haven't even seen that one.
Oh, it's in the OBR report following the autumn statement from Jeremy Hunt that the budget is balanced on the back of a 12p fuel duty increase in the litre of petrol, which the Prime Minister was asked about the other day and didn't rule out.
Well, look, I think probably the standard answer is I don't try and preempt future budgets, but more specifically, what I can say factually is for 12 years we've frozen duty on petrol, meaning that given inflation in real terms, the government's take has been coming down. So I do know that we've been doing that for a very long time, and for budgets of the future, I'm afraid we will have to wait till the future.
Grateful for your time. Grant Shapps, Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. 5 to 6, Joe's in Welwyn Garden City on the issue of the strikes. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Tom. First of all, I thought it was a great interview with Grant. I thought you asked some really good questions there. I was calling in. There's 2 points I wanted to make. I think the first one is, I think we're asking the wrong question here, and I think the government is prompting us to ask the wrong question here. What we're talking about is restricting people's ability to strike effectively, and the level to which that would happen obviously is up for debate, and the details aren't clear. But for me, I think what we really should be talking about is why are we in a situation now where all these public services, which the government is responsible for, why are all their workers now feeling the need to strike? None of them want to. They lose money doing this. But why are those services in this situation where it's clearly so bad and these people are so desperate that they are striking in order to improve their conditions? And I think the second point I want to make, which is particularly applicable to rail, is I think we need to be very careful about restricting people's ability to protest and to strike, because it's my understanding that the government legislated previously to make it so train workers can't run the services for the public without taking any money for tickets.
Yes.
And so what they've done by doing that is they've made it so the only thing that rail workers can do to protest their working conditions is to completely stop all services.
Listen, Joe, did that happen in Japan? Was it Japan or Canada where they basically said, I think it was I'm getting this all wrong, bus drivers or train drivers, either in Canada or Japan, said, we're not taking any money today, you can come on for free. And they brought to the negotiation table the government of whichever country they were in, because obviously that's a situation that couldn't carry on, but it is not possible here.
Yeah, so that's my understanding, yeah.
All right, well, it was loose on my understanding of it. But Joe, listen, appreciate